You continue to send in questions, so I will continue to answer as many as I can exclusively on this YouTube channel. So we have a little bit of a theme to this week's. We cobbled together a couple of questions that were demographic related, fertility rate related, birth rates, family formation. They were in that general vein. So we figured we'll group these together and I'll do my best to answer them for you. The first one comes from Isabelle in Geneva, Switzerland. Isabelle asks, Brian, in your conversation with Lyman Stone, she's referencing an episode we did in season 2, the middle of season 2. I think that was episode 18, I want to say. In your conversation with Lyman Stone, you discussed the many reasons behind declining fertility rates. Which of those causes do you believe governments could realistically influence in the next decade, and which are beyond policy's reach? Thank you for the question. I addressed some of that at the end of that episode, and I encourage anybody who's curious in this topic to go back and listen to my interview with Lyman Stone. It was one of the more popular interviews in terms of listenership and reaction, especially on the YouTube channel, which is probably why it's popping up again if that's becoming a recommended video. Given the topic, we were a little ahead of the curve in some ways on it, and there's been plenty of others opining on this since. So I think I talked a little bit about this in that episode, but I'll just say, since you're asking directly, I don't actually think governments can do a whole lot to affect birth rates. They can affect them incidentally and as a second or third order benefit from other policies. Look, I think at the end of the day, it's not really that hard to look at periods of time where there were quote unquote baby booms throughout the world and why that happened. Number one, when people feel economically secure, safe, physically safe, geopolitically safe, economically safe, spiritually safe, they tend to form families, have kids. They tend to maybe have more kids than they might otherwise. So throughout, the modern era, anytime we've seen a big increase in birth rates, it has generally been either after a major conflict has ended and people felt optimistic about the future. It's been because the economy was booming. There was a lot of money around. People felt really good about their situation. Or there was an extenuating circumstance. People came out of a traumatic situation and sort of retrenched in their personal life and focused on what they wanted out of life because all of a sudden there was a major incident or a terror attack or even some crisis like a pandemic. And with your mortality facing you, you kind of get back to basics, get back to fundamentals. And that's when sometimes people who put off having kids decide, I'm not going to wait anymore. And these are not things that governments can really affect directly so much as it's an indirect effect of policies that either make your country more or less prosperous, more or less safe, more or less likely to be in a conflict. So I think the biggest thing that governments can do to encourage, at least in the westernized world, the biggest thing that governments can do is to simply lighten the burden a little bit, to encourage especially women who want children but really struggle with the logistics of how they're going to be able to afford to raise kids and balance their professional life with their family obligations. I think that the more governments can do to support that in the home, and I don't care if it's a, progressive policy, a conservative policy, I don't care if it comes in the form of tax credits or grants or, subsidies to childcare facilities to open more of them. If it's more about, medical leave or family leave, I'm going to leave that to the elected officials, the policymakers, and the advocacy groups to sort out what the right prescription is. But I do think the one thing governments can do around the world who are not already prioritizing people with children is to simply recognize the burdens that come with raising kids, that have always come with raising kids, but understand that in most of the world now, having one parent stay home exclusively to focus on raising their kids is not practical. There are some households that can do it. There are some societies where it's easier than others, but in just the way our economy has evolved and the amount of human capital that we need in our economies to make them work, it takes both the men and the women out of the household, and it requires some sort of childcare support. Now, if there's one innovative thing, I'll say this, that I just, all over the world, especially in the industrialized Western world, the most underutilized resource we have are what I would call our elders. In a prior human era, when we were more of a tribal people, we understood that elders had such a critical role because not only of their wisdom and their experience, but their ability to help guide entire groups of people and to contribute to generations well before those that they have produced themselves. I don't think any of our societies do a good job tapping into our elders, many of whom take care of their grandkids, but some, maybe they only had one or two children, maybe they only had one or two grandchildren, maybe they had no grandchildren, but they have so much to contribute in very practical ways, especially as kids get past that initial stage of really needing mom and dad, every hour of the day. As kids get into their more semi-independent years, there's a much bigger role that elders of our communities can play in the lives of those children, easing the burden of those parents. And there's so much loneliness among our elders. It seems so obvious to me that this is a problem on both the younger and the older spectrum of our society, where we have elders who are lonely and need human interaction and purpose, and we have younger people who are completely overwhelmed and could use that, and somehow we're not connecting these two groups of people. And so I don't have the perfect prescription for it. I'm not here to give, political advice, but as a society, what is something that we could all do if you really focused on allowing the people who want to have kids to have them, and to lighten the burden of having those children? It's getting our elders more actively involved, whether it's your own grandparents, aunts, uncles, or whether it's a broader group. The elders of your neighborhood, the elders of your church, the elders of your nonprofit. There are so many people who are looking for purpose after they're done with their working years, and having a role as a mentor or a pseudo parent or even a child caretaker is a big part of that. And I don't think we can underestimate how much good that would do for society at both extremes. At the younger who are still in the beginning of their career and trying to balance that with raising kids, and at those who are past the end of their professional life and they're looking for a second or third chapter, and helping develop the next generation is a big part of that. Hopefully that helps. That's one of the questions I got on this topic. The next was from Takahiro in Osaka, Japan. Takahiro asks, if the global population begins shrinking in the second half of this century, how do you think that will reshape economies, culture, and international relations? And will the shift be more opportunity or crisis? So that is probably the $640 million question at this point that everybody, governments, businesses, nonprofits, political figures, are trying to answer. It seems very likely that global population will indeed begin declining as a whole. Population is already declining in many of the major economies in the world. We don't have great data out of some places. China, for example, sort of acknowledges at this point that some of the data they've given over the years may not be all that accurate. We know that to be true. We don't know how inaccurate it is. We know that other economies that have very large populations, including those in Africa, as those economies continue to mature, grow, develop, the population rate will likely slow down, and in doing so, it will begin to level off because they have an outsized contribution to global population growth. So if we take the assumption on the first half of the question that indeed global population will shrink, and I think it will, everybody wants to figure out how it's going to reshape things. Here's what I'll say as somebody who doesn't study this every day but asks questions of people, and I've done many shows on the topic. Everything that I've heard from the people who are in a position to know is that the current model of economic growth around the world, the current model of international relations will probably not sustain itself in a world of declining birth rates and a general decline in population, because the underlying principles of economic growth rely on there being more people in the next generation than there were in the last one. So if you take out that fundamental assumption, well, then you've taken out the foundation of the entire system built on it. However, let me say this economically speaking, specifically economically speaking. I think there's going to be a lot more opportunity than we think, but I believe that's because productivity, how much each individual human can produce for society, will be significantly enhanced, not just with the development of the AI technologies that we talk about today, but other technologies, other advancements, especially in things like robotics and drone technology, that are going to allow individual human beings to do the work that used to be done by 4 or 5 or 6. And also because there will be activities of our daily lives that will become so automatic and so easy that requires no brain power and no focus, that it will free up more and more human time to do other things. You know, a lot of people think about the advancements in the 19th century or the 20th century. Think about the day that you were able to bring a washing machine and a dryer into your home, and you no longer had to have a person wash an entire household's clothes by hand and then hang dry them and then fold them up and put them away. I mean, just think about how much time that freed up. And so many of the appliances in our homes today were designed to do the same thing. I think we're going to see another revolution of that technology. And so I do think productivity is going to bail us out here in many ways. But I also think we're going to probably have a different economic model in the future. We're going to have a situation where more and more people are able to contribute in multiple ways across different chapters of their lives. So, for example, today, a lot of us think about your economic contribution that you make when you're in your early years. You're going to make that same contribution. You're going to stay in the same career, work for a similar company, at least stay in the same industry for your whole life. I think we're going to have a different model. I think you're going to have a lot more people working with their hands in their younger years. And then as their bodies begin to wear out and break down, that chapter of their career closes and they begin spending more time in the knowledge or the service economy. And then as that chapter of their career ends, they move into a much more knowledge and service oriented, maybe even entrepreneurial, owners of businesses and so forth. And at each of those stages, they're contributing economically and culturally in different ways, but it's not consistent to their entire career. In other words, I don't think you're going to have as many people who start as a truck driver and end as a truck driver 40 years later. You're not going to have as many people who start as an electrician in their 20s and they remain working with their hands all the way into their 60s. I think we're going to develop into an economic model for individuals, for working class people and others, where there's progressive development of skills over time that allow them to reinvent themselves over and over and over. And we haven't really seen that in the modern economy. We've seen a lot of specialization. We haven't seen a lot of evolution. I think you are going to see more of that. And that's going to change a lot. And I think it will counterbalance some of the potentially negative economic effects of global population decline. And then there's the question of international relations. So the biggest issue here, very simply, is the influence that certain countries and regions will be able to have over time as their populations begin to fall. And I don't think there's any way for us to predict that because there are so many counter currents, if you will, in the implications of a declining population. It's hard to know where it all nets out. I'll give you an example. There are plenty of people in the demography community who say China's doomed. And the reason China is doomed is because they're in a population death spiral. They're going to be half the size that they are today. And if China is half the size in the future that it is today, its regional clout is going to decline. Its ability to project power around the world is going to decline. and they just will not be able to maintain their top economic position. Well, that might be true. It also might be true that if China ends up having half the population it has today, it'll have half the problems that it has today, especially if a lot of that population decline happens among its poorer and less educated sectors, and you end up with a country that has more people living longer who are higher up the economic ladder, who live in the cities, who, they have all of the social and economic advantages that you would want in a country, but with a lot fewer people who struggle to make ends meet on their farms. And those who remain are those who have found ways to be more and more effective, more and more efficient, more and more productive, right? There's a refinement that can happen there. So there's a model that says China would actually be better off being much smaller, having fewer people to take care of, not having to have as big of a social safety net if managed correctly. For those who say, well, if you lose your population, you lose your ability to control territory. Well, the Russians have lost population in Siberia for a long time. It's a sparsely populated territory. Doesn't restrict their ability to control it. Doesn't restrict their ability to defend it. Not yet. Now, at some point, if you have almost nobody out there, sure, you're at risk. But in the short term, not necessarily. And even if you look at a country like the United States, for as big as it is, if the United States population started to shrink, it's not going to shrink uniformly. The impact of that in rural communities is going to be outsized compared to overcrowded cities that don't have enough housing for people, right? So I simply say it's impossible to really be able to project what a shrinking population means for international relations. But I do think that for economic reasons and even for cultural reasons, we have plenty of reason to be optimistic and to not view this as some horrible crisis. That all having been said, like I said in my earlier question, if you want to grow your population and incentivize people to have more kids and sort of turn that tide around at some point 20, 30, 40 years from now, it's really about the policies that you would enact to make it easier to raise kids. And those very policies would also reshape the economy. Because imagine if you instituted some of those policies and you incentivized more people to go into, let's say, childcare work, how that would change communities and how that would change the concepts of where we would focus our economic growth and where we would even focus the next generation of education. Last point on this, I know this has been a longer segment, but these are really important questions, so I want to completely share with you my thinking. The biggest thing that I believe has gone under the radar on this topic is simply the question of our education system. And our education system, I don't believe anywhere in the world, is really optimized for a world in which overall population is stagnant or falling, and the economy, therefore, has to undergo a significant transformation. Our education systems around the world are really good at teaching us about the past. They're not great about projecting what's coming in the future. And I'm just concerned that a lot of the lessons that are being taught in these schools depend on a global model that will no longer be true. So I would simply say that I hope universities and academic institutions of higher learning, but even elementary and high schools, are thinking about how they're going to teach economics differently, but also how they're going to look at the world differently and help kids think about the world differently if all that they've ever really thought about and really known is a world of population growth. How do the lesson plans have to change, and how does our thinking about the world around us have to change? So that was a lot there. Hopefully you all got some interesting food for thought. That's all these are. I have no declarative statements where I feel like I can give you all perfect answers. But if I share with you how I'm thinking, then hopefully it triggers your own reactions and triggers your own thinking. If you'd like to reach out to me and be part of these programs by asking questions that get my answers, you can do so by emailing me info at brianjmatos.com. You can also share with me any of your questions on your favorite social media platforms. Leave comments on these YouTube videos. And you can also visit my YouTube channel, hit subscribe, and reach out to me directly with any questions that you may have, and we'll see if we can get them on the program. Thanks as always for listening. Look forward to talking to you again next time.